The concept of natural selection is the key motor force driving evolution. There are other factors, but we don't have time to pursue those in detail in an hour and 15-minute presentation. But I am going to try to focus on some of the key aspects of how natural selection drives the evolutionary process. And it's not meant to be a comprehensive presentation. I take a number of lectures in my regular classes, but at least I'll be able to touch on some of the key points. Though sometimes people confuse the word evolution and natural selection as if they're the same thing. Despite some would perhaps prefer not to accept this, evolution is actually a fact that is a confirmed set of observations, particularly linked to the dated fossil record and what we know of DNA. Natural selection is the scientific theory that explains how natural selection works and produces evolution as a result. And many people confuse the word hypothesis and theory as if they mean the same thing. But in natural science, a theory is a well-confirmed explanation. It's not a potential explanation like a hypothesis is. Oops, this is, I get this. So this chart we see up here is something I developed over the years of teaching Introduction to Biological Anthropology, putting together the various stages of the process, and deals with both genetic changes which don't actually result in species, and then also it deals with speciation. So let's start in the upper left there with mutations. Mutations are critical for evolution because they create genetic variation. And if you have no genetic variation, evolution is impossible. If everybody has the same set of genes in the population of a species, there's nothing to select because everybody has exactly the same genetic makeup. And it's genetic variation that allows the possibility for adaptations to new environments when some individuals happen to have a gene that's useful and increases their potential for survival in a changing environment. And as we'll see, the key factor in natural selection is differences in individual net reproductive success. And if you are surviving better and are healthier, you're more likely to be more reproductively fit. And over generations, you get gradual changes in gene frequencies, which we call microevolution, if you look at the middle square there in the top. Now, I just went through a lot of points quickly. It may have lost you, but we'll be going through this a bit more step by step. Now, one of the criticisms that some creationist groups level at evolution is that it's a random process and therefore couldn't possibly produce anything. And they use the analogy that it's like a hurricane blowing through a junkyard and assembling just by chance a 747 airplane. But evolution doesn't work that way. And natural selection, the main driving force, is anything but random. However, there is an important random process going on, and that's the generation of mutations. In all living species, mutations are generated in a random way, whether you have bacteria that reproduce asexually or in sexual reproduction. And you can't predict what specific mutations will occur and when they will occur or where they will occur. So they might appear in one part of the globe and not somewhere else among similar populations. There are different kinds of mutations, which I'm not going to go into in a great depth, but let's see here. And I've listed a few of them up here. We don't have the time to go in great detail, but I'll talk about them briefly. One of the most common overall description of mutations is that a great deal of them are copying errors, When a cell divides and copies itself, like in the process of mitosis that generates new nerve cells, skin cells, red blood cells, and so forth, you have to have a second set of chromosomes to be in the new cell that's being created. And so you have to copy the DNA in the chromosomes. But given that there are 3.2 billion bits of code in the chromosomes, and the copying is not a perfect process, you do get mutations. Sometimes it's just a single code letter that's off, and we call those point mutations, or sometimes code typos. And they're responsible, among other things, for about 4,000 different diseases that humans can get, like hemophilia, sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs disease, and a number of others. And this is the kind of mutation that's usually featured in introductory biological anthropology texts, but it's hardly limited to that. Other processes and these mutations also occur during meiosis, when sex cells from the testes and the ovaries make sperm or egg, and you can end up with errors in the gametes, or sperm and egg. And those are actually the most critical ones because they can be inherited by the next generation. If you have a mutation in a skin cell, it's not going to affect heredity. So the process of meiosis, the production of sperm and egg, and then conception passing on to the next generation is key here. There are other kinds of processes that can produce insertions, deletions of code letters or segments of code, inversions of the code. We won't go into the details, but they're a bit more complex than the single point mutations. And then we have a fascinating element called transposons, or jumping genes, often composed of large numbers of repeat sequences that can leave one part of the chromosome, go insert themselves somewhere else. Sometimes it doesn't really have any effect, but sometimes it ends up interrupting sequences of code for a gene and can actually do damage, can be harmful. And that brings us to the point about, are all mutations harmful? And the answer is no. Many of them can be, and they'll tend to get weeded out through natural selection if they're particularly harmful, although they're never really weeded out completely, but they get largely eliminated. But many of them are neutral. They don't have any particular effect. They're benign. Some of them are just alternative codes for the same amino acid. And then there are some that might be or end up being beneficial in changing environment. So we have to get away from the idea that mutations are always bad. Now, one of the more key type of mutations that is often not discussed in intro biotechs are gene duplications, and where an entire gene may be copied an extra time or two. And without going into a lot of detail, these extra copies with time can take on new functions, and they're critical for the evolution of complexity in organisms. For example, the evolution of color vision in the opsin genes, which are sensitive to different wavelengths of light. The more that you have, the more they can be fine-tuned to different spectrum of the colors, and the more detail you can see in colors. Humans are normally trichromatic, but some primates like New World monkeys are bichromatic and what we call red-green colorblind. They can't differentiate the level of color nuances that we can. Chromosome number errors refer to a process of chromosome non-disjunction, which occurs in the production of sex sperm and egg, in which you can end up with an incorrect number of chromosomes. Either one short, called monosomy, where you have 45 chromosomes, or trisomy, where you have 47. And the most common one, most of those are fatal to the embryo, and a woman may not even know that she had been pregnant because the miscarriage can occur in a couple of days or so. But one that's well known that can come to term is trisomy 21, or Down syndrome. But there are also anomalies in sex chromosomes, as I've shown you 4 possibilities here, which include things like Turner syndrome in women, Klinefelter syndrome in men, and others. We don't have time to go in detail. Chromosome fusion means during the evolution of a species, one or more chromosomes fuse together, so it reduces the number of chromosomes. And it seems pretty clear in the evolution of humans from our common ancestor that would also lead to the evolution of chimpanzees, that probably around 5 to 6 million years ago, somewhere around there, chromosomes 16 and 17 in chimps fused in what had been in the common ancestral line, fused together into what we know as chromosome number 2 in humans. And it's quite evident by the genes involved that this is what happened, and making us much less compatible, so that it's probably not possible to have humans or humanzees when you attempt to breed chimps with humans. Although differences in chromosome number don't automatically exclude such events. And then horizontal gene transfer is fascinating and applies only to bacteria, where two different kinds of bacteria can open up a tube between themselves and swap or send gene packets into the other one. And so they can literally change their genome without reproducing. And this is one of the mechanisms that allows resistance in one type of bacteria to an antibiotic to spread to other types. It's usually between similar types of bacteria where there's a swapping of genes, but sometimes it occurs with others. And bacteria can also gobble up bits of DNA from a dead bacteria in a fluid medium and absorb that into their genome. So bacteria can do some really weird things, which also makes it difficult to define species in bacteria because of this. So mutations then, which are a variety of types, are critical for producing genetic variation. And of course, we're talking about genetic variation in a population. Individuals do not evolve. Your genes do not change during your lifetime. Populations evolve over many generations. Now, the thing that is a critical factor for the process leading toward natural selection is the presence of environmental stresses and changes over there in the upper right. And we're going to look at some of those different types here. Now, one of the most critical and ongoing, it never disappears, are predator-prey relationships. When I talk about this subject in my bio classes, I'm reminded of a cartoon by Gary Larson, who's famous for doing some funny cartoons about anthropology. And he has a picture of this Tyrannosaurus Rex, and he has a calendar. And every day it says, find something and eat it, cross it off. Find something and eat it, cross it off. Find something and eat it, and essentially every day. Now we could add also, avoid being eaten, cross it off. Avoid being eaten, cross it off. And that sums up predator-prey relationships. All animals have to eat, and they got to avoid being eaten. And then in the larger scale of things, they're going to need to reproduce if their species is going to continue. So those are three critical factors then to think about. Now, predator-prey relationships are ongoing, and Richard Dawkins, in some of his books like The Ancestor's Tale and others, is an evolutionary biologist at Oxford, has talked about evolutionary arms races, where literally, if you have an eagle that feeds off, or a hawk that feeds off, say, rabbits or rodents, if the prey get a little better at escaping the predator, maybe by digging more burrow holes closer by so they can escape more quickly before the raptor can get them, this will tend to lead to more honed skills on the part of the raptor, perhaps in vision, to be able to spot them earlier or maybe fly a little faster, however. And as one gets better, the predator gets better at hunting the prey will tend to evolve mechanisms to get better at eluding the predator, and you get this constant evolutionary arms races. And this is one of the things that hones particular skills in particular animals. For example, eagles have a far bigger part of their brain devoted to vision than humans do because of the critical need to be able to see objects from a great distance. And so when I tell students that chimps are better than humans at looking at a series of numbers in squares on a screen, memorizing where they are, then the numbers disappear, and then they have to go point in order numerically where those numbers were. Chimps can do that better than humans as you reduce the amount of time they have to memorize. At some point, the humans fail completely, but the chimps can do it because evolution has honed this skill to be able to map the environment, in particular for food resources, is what we think, and has produced this kind of skill. So as intelligent and as self-aware and our characteristics of language, we are unique, but there are many skills we don't have but that have been honed in other creatures due to the evolutionary process. And often it's because of predator-prey relationships. So that's ongoing, an ongoing stress. And what would our major predator be? Speak up. Ourselves, yes, we often get that answer. Besides that, bacteria and viruses, disease essentially. And we're in an evolutionary arms race right now with a number of antibiotics that the bacteria are becoming resistant to, and we're starting to run out of options to treat certain diseases, including one strain of gonorrhea that almost nothing will kill, or MRSA, you've probably heard of. Yet 30 or 40 years ago, we thought we had all this licked. We got all these neat vaccinations and antibiotics, and we're done. And then 10 years later, whoops, it's not working now. What's going on here? Well, you're looking at evolutionary arms races between humans and bacteria. Now, the remaining ones I'm giving are punctuated events, or events that may be occurring or not. One is climate change. And it can be global warming, as is going on the Earth today through increased production of carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels, or it can be global warming from other causes, like during the Ordovician, or it can be global cooling that occurred during the Eocene about 55 million years ago. And this can threaten the adaptations of species. They may migrate to try to solve the problem, but if you're living up in high mountains, and in order to adjust, you have to migrate upward. At some point, you're going to reach the mountaintop and there's no place to go. So you can get extinctions. Another way would be if a carnivore, which is at the top of the food chain, sees its food supply being threatened by drought or other kinds of climate change, it might lead to its extinction as well. Sometimes one or two types of extinctions can lead to a cascade of extinctions, depending upon the ecosystem and the actual types of climatic change. Pollution. We're all probably familiar with human-type pollutions like burning of coal, which can produce, among other things, acid rain. The global warming that's occurring now with the carbon dioxide can also lead to the acidification of oceans, which can threaten plankton, which are at the base of the food chain. Whether you want to call carbon dioxide a pollutant, it could be questionable, but certainly we're talking about atmospheric changes. Now, at the end there, it lists mass extinctions. And one of them, 251 million years ago, during the Permian, is thought to have been caused by massive volcanic outpouring of basalt lava in the central Siberian plateau in Russia. This is an area tens of thousands of square miles in size, and the basalt deposits are miles deep. And so for thousands of years, this lava was pouring out, emitting all sorts of gases that are often toxic to living things. And that and related factors also led to the deoxygenation of the oceans, resulting in a 90 to 95% extinction of known plant and animal species. Can't measure it really for bacteria, but it was the most devastating mass extinction in the history of the Earth, but it does not appear to have been caused by, say, a meteor, and we'll talk more about that later. Also, coal burning, there's a famous study studying moths in New England and in England at different times, where coal burning during industrialization led to the darkening of trees, where certain kinds of moths were fairly well camouflaged against the tree trunk based on the color of the lichen. I remember when I was in Paris long ago when I was a student, they were having a drip treatment to many of their famous monuments because they were so gray and blackened by coal burning for a century that they looked pretty ugly. And so they used this acid drip and cleaned them up and they looked fantastic. Well, that same kind of coal blackening on the trees, what it produced was the following. In two different situations, England and New England at different times. Within a matter of decades, the moths, which had wings that were generally light-colored, with a minor number of them having dark-colored wings, over a few decades, because with the darkening of the trees, the dark moths were better camouflaged than the light-colored ones, and so the birds, which was their predator, were gobbling them up. And so essentially, if you had a gene for the darker moths, you had an edge in survival faced with the predator that was trying to eat you up. And what happened is each generation, the ones that were dark moths tended to have more offspring, be more reproductively fit because they weren't being eaten as much as the light-colored ones. And slowly but surely, generation after generation, the frequency of the gene that produced the darker colored wings became more and more and more important, okay? And so in this case, the stress was a pollution, and they happened to have a gene already present that produced some moths that were dark wing, but they weren't very numerous because they tended to get eaten up much more easily because they didn't blend into the white lichen on the trees. So as environmental conditions change, different types of genetic variation that might be present may assist individuals in surviving, and those that survive and reproduce more will tend to send more genes into the future generations. And we'll come back to this point with some other examples later when we look at what essentially I've been describing as natural selection. Invasive predators. One of the things that we have today with humans being able to travel, especially by airplane, but also by boat and so forth, around the world, is that we can accidentally, sometimes intentionally, bring a plant or an animal from one continent to another. And arriving there, it may find that it may just go extinct if it can't adapt to that different environment, may not survive. But if it does, and it also doesn't have any natural predators, it may explode into the landscape and do extremely well. This is all, and I'll give some examples in a minute, but it's not only human travel that has caused this. If we look at the history of continental drift based on the theory of plate tectonics in geology, which talks about how the molten core of the earth and the convection currents within it tend to make the crust, which sort of lies on this molten core, to drift in different patterns. And at least twice in our history of our planet, most of the continents were all grouped together in one large landmass. I think around 450 million years ago, and then again in 200 million years ago. And then those continents began to drift apart, or drift together. For example, North America and South America used to be separated 40, 50 million years ago. But beginning between 3 and 5 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama gradually emerged and linked the two continents. And then all sorts of creatures that had evolved in North America migrated into South America, and all sorts of creatures that had evolved in a different ecosystem or set of ecosystems in South America, which has a tropical climate, much of it, tried to migrate northward. And it produced a series of extinctions in both continents, more severe in South America than North America, because you had animals moving into new environments, and sometimes they found they had no predators. Or existing species had no defenses against the new predator and rapidly went extinct. Give you a good example, and this involving human travel. The island of Guam used to have a wide-ranging number of bird species, many of them unique to the island. And then someone brought snakes to the island. These birds had no history of snakes being in their ecosystem. They built their nests on the ground. The snakes come in, gobble up their eggs, easy to find on the ground, and soon many of them, within a few decades, were extinct. If these birds had evolved in an ecosystem where snakes were already present, they would evolve mechanisms to be more protective of their nests, perhaps build them in trees or elsewhere so snakes could not easily get to them. But because they weren't present as they evolved in their own ecosystem, they really had no defenses and not the time to evolve defenses with the new predator. Now, of course, humans have the advantage with our own technology and culture. We can rapidly adapt without having to biologically adapt. Most creatures, almost all other creatures, can't do that. Now, some other invasive predators here in the United States are the quagga mussel, a small, tiny mussel that comes from Asia. They got brought into the Great Lakes, and now we spend billions of dollars a year trying to clean them out of freshwater intake pipes going to the cities along like Chicago and so forth. Recently, unfortunately, somebody with a boat brought them to one of the lakes here in San Diego County. They were attached to the bottom of their boat, but not dead, and they ended up spreading them into one of the lakes here in San Diego. And they're a very costly species to deal with in terms of maintenance. They're another type of aquatic plant that's invaded many of the canals and riverways of Florida that's very expensive to dredge and get rid of. It doesn't have any natural predators. There's also the python that got let loose in the Everglades and is gobbling up many of the indigenous smaller animals, pushing them toward extinction because they had no defenses with the python, nor were they familiar with what they might do. Then there's, you're all familiar with tumbleweed. That was imported from Russia in the mid to late 1900s. Fairly harmless, though I did see a year or so ago a huge storm which actually buried some houses in piles of tumbleweeds, but it probably didn't destroy them. So the tumbleweed is one thing, but then there is another plant called leafy spurge, which also comes from Asia, and it is replacing grazing land in Montana and Wyoming and some of these areas. Cattle won't eat it. It kills off and outcompetes the native species. It puts roots 20 feet down into the ground. So you can't just, go pull them out by the roots. Pesticides are very expensive in the long term if you have to use large amounts, counterproductive. They finally found a way to deal with this invasive species by importing millions of beetles from Russia that attack through the root system and lay larvae in it and kill it. And so literally they fly airplanes now and drop millions and millions of beetles into these fields, and leafy spurge is finally retreating to some extent, and they're able to regain back some of that grazeland. So invasive species will continue to be a problem for humans with the kind of international travel that's always possible. Now, adaptive radiation doesn't mean good X-rays. Radiation here means migrating out from one place to another. And in Darwin, actually, that was important to some of his discoveries when he discovered on the Galapagos Island a bunch of species of finch, which he later discovered were unique to the Galapagos, but appeared to be related to an ancestral finch in mainland Ecuador. And we don't know exactly how those finches got to the Galapagos, whether it was a storm. Somebody recently hypothesized, because of the timing and the age, that a massive volcanic eruption forced birds way out to sea to avoid the masses of ash and rock and so forth, and they ended up being stranded on the Galapagos. And then over time, as they adapted to different environments there, whole sets of new species of finch developed. And adaptive radiation, whether it's intentional or otherwise, spreading out into new environments, often is associated with high rates of speciation. As over time, you can have extinctions as well, but often high rates of speciation as there's an adaptation to these new environments to the process of natural selection. And some other examples of this include the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs had the chance of evolving at a time when all of the continents were together in one big mass. That's why you find dinosaur fossils in every continent, even Antarctica. And they were the first true dominant land animals. They were reptiles, they weren't mammals, and they evolved into a whole wide variety of habitats and ecological niches. When mammals came along, they struggled for a long time as small rodents living in holes in the ground, and they weren't getting anywhere competing with dinosaurs in terms of expanding into new niches. Then the mass extinction of 65 million years ago came along, where a meteor 10 to 12 miles wide struck the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, created forest fires around the world because the vaporization of the meteor sent up soot. And we know this was a meteor because we found a rare earth called iridium in the deposits from that epoch. And that's rare on Earth, but common in meteors. And we find a 6-inch to 2-foot thick clay layer on most of the Earth that's extremely rich in soot from all the burning that occurred, as well as the element iridium. But what it did is wipe out the ammonites, these big coiled shellfish that sometimes are this far big in diameter in the oceans, and many other marine species, and also, as you know, wiped out the dinosaurs. Well, now you had all these ecological niches and habitats freed up. The dinosaurs are gone. And beginning about 50 to 55 million years ago, most of the animal forms you know in the zoos from North America and so on, and elsewhere, they evolved in the last 50 million years. They weren't here before that. It was only when they had the chance to radiate into new environments that you ended up with high rates of speciation and the evolution of new forms of animals. So adaptive radiation into new habitats and niches vacated by mass extinctions or otherwise, perhaps through migration, is a very important process. A couple of other examples. There are monkeys in Central and South America. Where did they come from? Because they didn't evolve in the New World. There were prosimians in North America that went extinct, but there's nothing in the fossil record that suggests the monkeys there evolved there on their own. But what we do think, based on several lines of evidence, is that about 35 to 40 million years ago, South America was much closer to Africa. 120 million years ago, they were right up against each other. And then continental drift sent them apart and is still sending them apart about an inch per year. And about 35 to 40 million years ago, it appears that a monkey species, and we found the equivalent in the fossil record of Africa that has 3 premolars instead of 2 like all the monkeys have in Africa today and elsewhere in the old world, managed to raft over to South America. And I don't mean they chopped down trees and made a raft and with a sail, but we know this happens from studies in the Indonesian archipelago that sometimes animals are feeding on berries or leaves on trees that are sitting in the eddies of major rivers. Then a big flash flood comes up. It could involve with mangrove swamps as well, and they get pushed out to sea on these vegetations. Most of the time they die, but once in a while they float with the ocean currents to new land, hop off, and if you have at least a male and a female or a pregnant female, they can survive. And all the monkeys in the New World derived from a single monkey species that made it over there 35 to 40 million years ago. And the DNA are quite clear on this. And there is a fossil called Opidium, a genus Opidium, with 3 premolars that is found in Africa. All of those types became extinct in Africa later, but their descendants survived in the New World. And also, because of this different evolutionary pathway, this is why almost all New World monkeys are red-green colorblind. They only rarely evolved to be trichromatic like ourselves. Only the howler monkey and some female marmosets have the same color vision that we do. The rest are red-green colorblind. And then, of course, there's us. We evolved in Africa and spread out to all of the other continents, and we're probably the most destructive invasive species in the history of the planet, as we're pushing lots of other species to extinction. In fact, they estimate the extinction rate right now, due to human destruction of habitat, is 5 to 10 times more than the normal background extinction in the history of the planet. excluding mass extinctions. In fact, some refer it as the 6th mass extinction that's ongoing right now. By the way, the International Geological Commission is set to possibly decide to put us in a new epoch. We've been in the Holocene the last 10,000 years since the end of the ice ages, but because of massive transformations and effects on the land and the sea and the oceans by humans, they're seriously considering saying we are now in the last century or more in the Anthropocene, the period of human influence. And then mass extinctions, Darwin was not aware of those, and I'm not going to go into all of the others. We highlighted the Permian extinction 251 million years ago, and the more recent one 65 million years ago. But they, of course, can have a catastrophic consequences for large numbers of species, and often they're so dramatic that natural selection is of little value. Extinction happens anyway. But then it does clear the way for the evolution of new species. In fact, if you were to go back before the Permian extinction and look at the plant and animal life of that time, and then come back 40 million years later, 30 million years later, completely different environment. Huge new sets of new plants and animals evolved after that extinction because it wiped out 90 to 95% of them. It was such a devastating extinction. So, mutations create genetic variation, and under the conditions of environmental stress or change, natural selection kicks in. Because if any particular mutation gives an edge to individuals struggling to adapt to a new environment, they will tend to be healthier, more reproductively fit, and their genes will be passed on to the next generation in higher frequencies than those that say with a disease died off and had few or no children. For example, we can take the bubonic plague, which struck Europe in the 14th and 15th century, and particularly in the 1340s and 1350s, ultimately killing about 1/3 of the population of Europe. Europeans had no immunity to the bubonic plague. So, and it was also a very contagious disease. And we also had no theory of disease then, so people thought it were evil spirits or the act of God, or however you'd like to phrase it. But in any case, some people had genetic resistance that allowed them, maybe they got sick, but they didn't get really sick, and they didn't die, and they lived to have offspring. And the gene that gave them that resistance would get pushed into the next generation because more people with those genes would have survived the plague than those that didn't have it. And generation after generation after generation, after 150, a couple hundred years, Europeans evolved immunity to that disease. There's also been some changes in the virulence of the disease itself, such that it's not nearly the terrible thing that it once was. So natural selection results from differences in the net reproductive success of individuals. Net in the sense that you have children, and then those children must survive to be able to have offspring themselves. If you have children and they die of infant mortality before the age of 5, that's not going to help much. Okay. And this is not a random process in any sense of the term, and is the motor force leading to evolution. Now I'm going to go to the central box, and then I'll stop a bit for some questions because I've covered quite a bit, and then we'll look at speciation after that. So there are 3 results, minimally, of the natural selection process. First, we can define the minimal level of evolution going on as microevolution, which is defined as a change in gene frequencies, in the frequency of a gene or genes from one generation to the next in a population. So that if you were to look at all the different genes in the species and map out them all and the frequencies of each, and then come back, say, 3 generations, you'll find that some genes have decreased in frequency, others have increased, and in particular, those with fairly sharp increases are probably, especially in larger populations, is probably the result of selection forces. And so minimally, we have what we call a microevolutionary process going on, as in the resistance of humans to the bubonic plague, or bacteria to antibiotics, insects to the use of pesticides, and so on. Now, Herbert Spencer in the late 19th century argued that evolution equals progress. And one could argue perhaps that evolutionary arms races hone certain skills, then you might call that an element of progress. But really, evolution is much more about adaptation. If evolution is successful through natural selection, it produces a better fit between the members of a species and their environment. The fact that a new type of clam would evolve that was better suited to a particular environment, would you call that progress? Well, unless you define progress as adaptation, it's questionable if that's the best word to use. But many Americans believe that it equals progress, in part because of the history of ideas in our own country and the strong influence that Spencer had in the 19th and early 20th century. But really, if you really want to fully understand what happens with evolution, if it's successful and you don't end up with extinction, is adaptation. That's what's going on. Local adaptation, because it's not, if a species is living in the southern part of South America, it's not happening all over the world. It's happening where that species is struggling to survive. And finally, there are changes in design. And I purposely use that word because one of the favorite arguments since St. Thomas Aquinas, 800 or 900 years ago, William Paley, when he wrote his book in 1807 called Natural Theology, he said, I have a watch. I know there must have been a watchmaker, a designer, that made this work and function the way it does. And often the argument of creationists was that there are too many complex things in life, including, for example, the human eye, that how could they possibly evolve? How could they have evolved and survived in all the intermediate stages? In fact, we can see many intermediate stages of eye evolution in living creatures today. And we don't have time to go into the detail of that, but evolution designs, but it never designs from scratch. It always builds on the previous evolutionary history of the organism. So natural selection can't transform, say, an insect into a whale. They have totally different body plans, and you're constrained by the previous evolutionary history of the organism. But with whatever genetic variation is present, certain kinds of adaptations through natural selection may be possible. And the kinds of changes in design that are produced through natural selection without any central direction include both phenotypic and genotypic changes. What is phenotypic change? Well, simply it's what you can see, like the moths now have dark wing, mostly moths, instead of light wing moths, okay? Genotypic is always occurring because that's about changes in gene frequency. So you're always having those gene frequency changes. Whether they're always visible to the naked eye as phenotypic changes, that would depend. Some of them may occur at the cellular level or in blood type, where you'd have to look under a microscope to identify it. But and then, of course, ultimately it gets blurred with the fact you can now go right down to the genome and look at the genotype. Is that phenotype now that you can look at it? So there's kind of a fuzzy distinction there. But so minimally, evolution produces the changes in gene frequencies we call microevolution. It produces some level of adaptation, if it works, and some level of changes in design. Now, to finish this part before we allow some questions, one of the issues with regard to design is how can natural selection act without any central direction? Now, for many who, when they first accepted evolution in the 19th century, they saw God as either creating the process and setting it in motion or guiding it along, particularly with human creation. But Darwin says no, with natural selection, this can occur without any central direction. And he had a good metaphor he used that Adam Smith used in his Wealth of Nations to describe how prices are determined through the law of supply and demand. Unless you have monopolies, that can fix the price, or the government. Essentially, prices change whether on the stock market or elsewhere because as a result of individual decisions to buy and sell. That generates the price, the ever-changing price. It's not being centrally directed. And Adam Smith called that the invisible hand. And Darwin thought that was a good metaphor for understanding how natural selection works. Individual differences in net reproductive success result in evolution without any central direction over time.
So with the changes in design, you said that it's based off of the past generation of their mutations, correct?
That is, as you compare the frequency of different genes from one generation to the next, if the changes have occurred, there are other mechanisms in evolution like genetic drift we don't have time to talk about in very small populations. But if natural selection is acting, there will be a change in gene frequencies, however, that builds up over time as you go from one generation to the next, because you're looking at a population of individuals. It's not just the change in an individual, since individuals can't evolve.
So are we able to trace that back to the first occurrence of whether something popped up, like the evolution of the eye? Because we could see that it was just bacteria and single-cell organisms before, and then eventually they would have to have the mutation for an eye.
The
or
earliest
such.
evidence for simple eye-like structures are light-sensitive cells that minimally could detect movement. Then in the case of the camera eye, there was evolution toward either some kind of cup or hollow space that, depending upon where the light was coming from, it would indicate position as well as movement, more or less like that. Later, a lens evolved as just a kind of tissue that helped focus the light. In fact, they're what called crystallins, a type of protein that actually does that focusing in all eye-like structures that we're familiar with, like the camera eye. And one of the interesting thing is, remember when I said you got to eat, you got to avoid being eaten, and you got to find a mate? What better thing to evolve than an eye to solve all three of those problems? And Richard Dawkins argues that the evolution of eye-like structures was probably inevitable as complex life developed, because it's obviously going to help you find food, avoid predators, and to find a mate. And so we see even camera-type eyes evolving in 40 separate different evolutionary lineages. Even jellyfish have camera eyes, some species of them. Might surprise you. And some of them have different evolutionary pathways. For example, the octopus has a camera eye, but it doesn't have a blind spot because it didn't have that in its previous evolutionary history in terms of how the eye evolved. But vertebrates do have that blind spot. I don't know if I fully answered your question.
Yeah, you did.
Anybody else? Gentleman here? Can you, yeah, Becky, I appreciate your help on that.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, so I don't know exactly how to ask this, but the origin of all species essentially would be a single cell bacterium that would reproduce asexually, correct? And
That's what we think, yeah.
Right, and it would absorb nutrients through some kind of fluid medium.
Perhaps, yeah, maybe involving an osmotic process.
And this essentially happened for about a billion years before we saw multi-cell organisms.
Actually,
correct?
life goes back to about 3.5 to 3.7 billion, and multicellular life appears at about 2.1 billion, but what's not clear to me is whether they're referring to multiple cells that are the same or multiple cells that have differentiation involved. That's something I'm checking on right now, because the date used to be 850 million years ago, but a recent find in Gabon suggests that multicellular life might go back further.
So my question is essentially if through natural selection you're trying to become more fit for your environment, how does becoming more complex, if you're already able to absorb nutrients and reproduce asexually, what advantages do you have to forming a multicellular organism, which you would think would require greater levels of, I don't know, cellular coordination and things of that nature.
Well, we don't have time to go and try to answer that with a lot of specifics, though there's evidence in the Cambrian period that you start seeing developing predator-prey relationships where species can move. Because in the Ediacaran, prior to that, there's one exception, there's little evidence that creatures could move. So how would they prey on others unless they're just consuming tiny plankton? And that this led to armor plating on fish at that particular time as a way to defend against predators. So any change in the environment which may create a need that would be important for your survival is going to lead to evolution. Remember, it's not a conscious process. So if something's going to decrease the survivability, it's either going to go extinct or certain genes that might be present will help it survive, and that will become more important, and you'll get evolutionary change over time. It's a self-driving process in the context of environmental stress and change. But you don't know where it's going. You could not predict that Homo sapiens would necessarily evolve in the process. You could argue that maybe self-aware, intelligent beings with language have evolved somewhere else in the universe, but they would not be Homo sapiens. The chances of that are about nil. Okay. All right, I'm going to go on to the speciation area because we have another speaker in a while. Now, the critical factor for speciation is some kind of geographic and or behavioral isolation. And you'll see when I'm talking about behavior, we're talking specifically about mating patterns and how that might isolate populations. Because if you don't have some degree of, you don't have isolation, then any new genes that occur in this group will get mixed and flow out through the rest of the group because they're constantly in contact and have the possibility of mating and through recombination, having these genes in all of the offspring. So, I think this is our last slide, yeah. So what we have up here, depending upon the barrier, and it could be a mountain range, it could be a major river, it could be other kinds of examples I'll be giving to. But once you get a certain level of isolation, things start happening differently in those two groups, let's say of the same population, if they somehow get isolated. First of all, the sets of mutations that develop in the two populations won't be the same. Since mutations are random, the set of mutations that are going to be produced in one of the populations will not be the same as the other. So there you already have differences in genetic variation over time. Secondly, and particularly if they happen to be in slightly different environments already, the environmental challenges that can develop will be different. And so what will be selected for and what adaptive needs are necessary over time will also be different. And the combination of the two, different sets of mutations and adaptations to different environmental pressures over time, because you're in two separate areas and isolated one group from the other, will create separate evolutionary pathways. They're not predictable what they're going to produce, but they're not going to be identical. And this ultimately can end up producing new species, as I'll try to show in some examples. So let's say we have a mountain range, and you see where I have these dashed lines, and then it says barrier, and we have species A. Let's pretend that species A is a species of bird population. And that over here we have the coast, and then we have the bird species A, then a big mountain range, 12,000 feet. On the other side, due to a rain shadow, a more arid environment. And let's say some unusual storm blows a group or a flock of members of species A over the mountainside to the other side. And because of the distance and the rarity of such events, they don't get back together. So we've got species A on the left side of the barrier there, on the seaward side or ocean side of the mountain range, and on the leeward or more arid side. So they're both species A. And I'm only showing the changes in one, but theoretically over here it could also have its own changes. And over time, microevolutionary processes can lead species A to be A1 with some genes more frequent than others and changes in gene frequencies. and with more time, it changes into a variant A2, A3, A4, A5, and over a long, long period of time, there may be so much change going on that if we took A5 or A6 and tried to mate them with the birds in species A on the other side of the mountain, they can't mate, they can't reproduce. Because one of the key definitions of animal species is that you can and do mate and reproduce and produce fertile offspring. Like a horse and a donkey can mate and produce a mule, but the mule is sterile. So it shows they're closely related species, but they are separate species. So it's not guaranteed, nor is there a time involved which you could say after such and such a time you'll have a new species. But given enough time, the birds to the east may have evolved just enough that when you bring them back into the original parent group, they no longer can reproduce. And it could be for a variety of reasons, like the sperm is toxic to the egg, or it can't penetrate the egg, or perhaps the birds have evolved new bird songs or mating dances that are different. And when they come over here, the females ignore the males because they're not doing the right dance, okay? So you can gradually end up with new species. But it doesn't have to be a mountain range. It could be a big river. A good example, and I'm going down some of the ones down here at the bottom, the Congo River, and if the river's going to be a barrier, it has to be perennial, meaning it's flowing all year long. It's not a seasonal thing, whereas a dry riverbed for a good part of the year. Well, there's a common ancestor to the chimpanzee and the bonobo, two different types of chimpanzees. And I believe the bonobo is north of the Congo River, if I recall. South, okay. They're south, and so what happened is two groups of ancestral chimpanzees were separated by the Congo River, which is in some places a mile wide, and the apes don't swim anyway, so they're not going to cross it. And one of the major differences on the two sides of the river is that one group had to compete with gorillas, which eat up a lot of understory, making the food available for the bushes and lower types of vegetation. They're big creatures, they eat a lot of food each day. And so the one ancestral group of chimpanzees has to find food where it can get it in scattered fruit trees. Whereas on the other side, there's no gorilla, and there's abundant vegetation. And one of the differences, I think it's Frans de Waal who developed this idea in his book on the bonobos and chimpanzee evolution, that in the one group, the scattered food supplies led to very small groups or individuals foraging, and especially females, whereas those that would eventually evolve in the bonobo, females began to forage in large groups, and this had all sorts of repercussions. Among your chimps, you evolve into a highly male-dominated society with physical competition for access to females leading to much bigger males than females, whereas among the bonobo, there was plenty of food. Females often were organized in groups, and the dominance hierarchy among the females was quite strong. And so you tended to have a more egalitarian relationship between the species. In fact, bonobos in captivity tend to dominate the males. And overall, it led to a much lower level of aggression in bonobos, some unusual sexual activity involving both homosexual and heterosexual sex to create harmony in society, which you certainly don't see among the chimps. And I'm oversimplifying this, and it's still partly hypothetical, but essentially a different barrier, a barrier led to one evolutionary pathways to become bonobos on one side of the river and to become or continue to be like modern chimpanzees on the other side, due to differences in ecosystems and environments that they had to adapt to. They relate both to competitors for the food supply as well as the level of food supply. Now, you can have speciation develop in cases where you would think it wouldn't happen. For example, in East Africa, you have Lake Victoria, which is several hundred miles long, north, south, and east, west. Very large lake. It's only about 200 feet deep, but it's a pretty massive body of fresh water on the level of your Great Lakes in the United States. And about 12,000 years ago, we know from coring the lake bed that it was completely dry for some time. And all the group of fish called the cichlids that might have lived there would have been rendered extinct. And then as climate change much more rainfall and rivers started refilling up the lake, just over the last 10 or 12,000 years, a huge number of different species, a significant number of different species of cichlid have evolved in just a few thousand years. How did this happen, since they're all in the same lake and they could theoretically mate with any female anywhere in the lake? Well, it turns out that there are freshwater reefs in the lake, scattered in a few places along the shore, but not necessarily in proximity. And mating patterns develop where cichlids were raised. They would mate with females or females mate with males associated with that particular freshwater reef. So each of those became kind of a place where a group gets separated from the others due to their mating patterns because being in proximity with that freshwater reef. Now, if there had been a continuous reef around the whole lake, perhaps that wouldn't have happened. But just the mating patterns help create the isolation and you produce all these species in a relatively rapid period of time. There are studies of certain types of insects that only mate with other insects of their type and associated with a particular saguaro cactus or small grove of them, and they don't venture out a few hundred yards away to another grove, and in some cases that's actually produced separate species. Now, one of the tricks with speciation, of course, is you can't always assume because there's separation and difference that they couldn't interbreed, but usually there are not funds available to test every species with artificial insemination, see if they could reproduce or not. So sometimes we think are separate species, oops, look, they had an offspring, what happened? But in any case, the separation there by groves of cactus trees produce species. And then we've already talked about the example of adaptive radiation, which can lead to speciation. In this case, separated from the finches and their ancestors on the mainland, led to the evolution of a number of different species there. So isolation is critical here. And it can be an obvious geographical barrier, but it can sometimes be coupled with evolution changes in mating behavior associated with specific points on the landscape that could also lead to new species. Now, I'll conclude with ourselves and Neanderthals. When Neanderthal was first found in the mid-19th century, a bit earlier but not really identified as something interesting until the 1850s. And then the first fossil of Homo sapiens, Cro-Magnon, was found about 1868. Now, especially after Marcel M. Boule wrote a book about the Neanderthals and described a particular skeleton and suggested these creatures may be humpbacked and et cetera, the image of Neanderthals is kind of these dumb brutes. And there are films made about them, even silent films going back to the 20s, suggesting that. And then in the 50s, 60s, 70s, a kind of a rehabilitation of Neanderthals, some claiming they're just as bright as Homo sapiens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there is a time, now one thing you should understand is that the current data suggests strongly that Neanderthal and Homo sapiens have a common ancestor. And I don't mean back to the first single cell. I'm talking about a recent common ancestor. And we call that species Homo heidelbergensis, which originated in Africa and then later migrated into Europe. And it spawned a new species we call Neanderthal in Europe and West Asia, but it spawned Homo sapiens in Africa. So we have a common ancestor between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. But they live separately. No Neanderthals have ever lived in Africa. There's no fossils of Neanderthal there. And the first fossils we have of Homo sapiens in Europe are between 40 and 45,000 years ago. Before that, there were no Homo sapiens there, and if you go back 100,000, they weren't anywhere in the world except in Africa. So by about that time, influence of Chris Stringer and his book African Exodus, his study of Neanderthals, many wanted I have to backtrack a minute. During the 50s through 70s, some suggested in Europe that Homo sapiens evolved from Neanderthals. And if you look at skulls that you could buy then for instructional purposes, it would call us Homo sapiens sapiens, and Neanderthals were Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, as if we were subspecies, one of the other. But In the last 20 years or so, most were beginning to see Neanderthal as a separate species, and there was no proof of interbreeding. Then Svante Pääbo, a few years ago, an amazing jump in technology over a few years, was able to isolate the chromosomes of Neanderthal after they'd first done mitochondrial DNA. Turns out we did mate, and every human whose ancestry is Asian or European has about 2% on average Neanderthal DNA, although often a different 2%. So, does that mean we're the same species? We interbred, and there's evidence for this, although there's no evidence of a hybrid population with significant mixture of both. We have 1 or 2 examples in the fossil record, but no evidence of a hybrid population. So would you accept that you're Neanderthals? Is that cool? Well, let's look at it a little more closely. Species boundaries are not absolute, and they develop gradually. It's clear that reproduction did occur between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens now and then, but what's interesting is that so little of it remains, and as I was seeing in a talk by Pascal Gagneux from UCSD yesterday, it turns out that most of the genes of Neanderthal that Homo sapiens have are in what are called gene deserts. Segments of the DNA where there are not normally any protein coding genes, just part pseudogenes, junk DNA, maybe some regulatory genes. And that's not by accident. It looks like Neanderthal genes, when they did get mixed with humans, were purged, except in areas where they're not going to cause any problem, it's this way Pascal describes it. So it looks like reproduction occurred, but there's no evidence then or would have led to a new species of a hybrid between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. So given the fuzzy boundary of species anyway, because of being a gradual process, I think it would be reasonable to accept that for all intents and purposes, we're separate species, but we were on that border there where we could and did interbreed occasionally. Others may have different views. Okay, it's 5 to 11. I think your talk is at 11:10. So we'll have at least 5 minutes or more, maybe a little more, for any other questions. Speciation is the key issue, of course, particularly among creationists who don't want to accept evolution. Even in intelligent design, which accepts microevolution, and the old Earth won't accept speciation, because that involves fundamental things that would contradict what it says in Genesis, essentially. All right, well, thank you very much.